Making the type of videos I make, I can't deny how pretentious I can often be. I talk about characters like Venom and Gwenpool with the weight of the world, as if they're humanity's greatest achievements. As proud as I am of what I've done, it's also pretty embarrassing and cringy how overtly sentimental I am about so much stuff. But it's something that I can't help but be, especially when it comes to my favorite pieces of media. When looking back or re-experiencing some of my absolute favorite video games, music, shows, and comics, there's this emotion I have for them that goes beyond just excitement and appreciation. It's gratitude. Gratitude for all the people who spent so much time and effort to create wonderful and meaningful art that has connected with me on a much deeper level than most. And today, I want to talk about one of them. I want to talk about Scott Pilgrim. Created by Brian Lee O'Malley and later colored by Nathan Fairbairn, Scott Pilgrim is a 6-volume comic book series. This started in 2004 and ended in 2010. And I really love it. It's about a broke, lazy, and dumb 23-year-old named Scott Pilgrim who lives with his funny gay roommate Wallace in a pretty crappy apartment. Scott also plays bass in a mediocre band along with my favorite character Kim and lead singer Stephen Stills. Scott is in a relationship with a 17-year-old girl named Knives Chow who is absolutely obsessed with him. But he ends up falling in love with Ramona Flowers, a girl he constantly sees in his dreams. And to date her, he needs to defeat her 7 evil exes. This is the main plot in the story of Scott Pilgrim, a lanky, unfit, irresponsible, and forgetful dude who has to somehow beat his girlfriend's 7 evil exes just so that he can continue to date her. It is absolutely stupid, and I love every single thing about it. All in all, the series is over 1,000 pages, but it is quite a quick read. The art is expressive, the character designs are charming as heck, and the colors by Nathan Fairbairn add so much life to the whole book. I love how real the characters feel, not because all of them have some tragic backstory and darkness inside them, but it's mostly because of how awkward and dumb everybody is all the time. Scott is not a role model protagonist at all. He has a terrible sleep schedule and is so forgetful that he doesn't even remember his own brother's face. He is such an embarrassing and dumb main character, but it makes for the funniest moments. He makes a song for Ramona, but almost all the lyrics in the song are just her name repeated over and over again. He's relatable because he's just not good when it comes to most things. When he fights Gideon, the final villain, and wants him to shut up from his evil villain monologue, he just says, "Shut up, you guy," which is just a terrible comeback as pointed out by Wallace. It's so funny how all of his friends have to keep up with him. Scott has a lot of friends, but he's kind of a nuisance to most of them. There's even a part in the book where he doesn't have a place to live, and so he ends up sleeping in like 3 of his friends' different places just to survive. There's also a lot of awkward kisses and embarrassing moments among the Scott Pilgrim social circle that I cannot help but laugh at. This is really one of the funniest comics I've ever read in my entire life, and even though I may not have described the comic that comedically, because I'm not that funny of a guy, it's something I know you would love if you would read it for yourself. It's not just Scott that creates the comedy though, but a lot of his friends have some of the best lines in the comic. Speaking of his friends, I love how much this comic feels like a friend group hangout a lot of the time. They often go out together, whether it's to the beach, costume parties, or restaurants, and sometimes these scenes don't have much of a point to them. Not every location has to have this big, grand, and epic moment. Sometimes you just have a bunch of cute dialogue between characters, or a funny, weird incident to later be joked about. But these segments create a sense of community between characters, giving them a lot of depth that they would otherwise not have. We end up knowing a lot about each of them. We know that Stephen Stills works at a restaurant, Kim works at a video rental store, Scott's sister Stacy works at a coffee shop, and his ex Envy is a superstar singer. We know their personalities as well, like Julie being a rude douchebag and Lisa being seductive and awkward because of repressed romantic feelings for Scott in the past. Although the book is mostly focused on Scott Pilgrim and Ramona Flowers, the other characters are given a lot of smaller moments that end up amounting to a clearer picture of who they are. It's why so many people's favorite characters are not the main ones. They love Wallace, Lisa, Knives, and especially Kim. Totally unrelated, but a specific thing I love about this comic is the bouts of unbridled joy a lot of the characters have. The way their pupils dilate when they get so excited over stuff is just so charming and hilarious. For example, Stephen Still's roommate is called Young Neil, but he isn't actually that much younger than the rest of the characters in the book. And when Scott finally calls him just Neil near the end of the comic, he gets so pumped up and joyous about it. It is the best day of his life. But Scott Pilgrim isn't just a funny, charming, and action-packed comic with awkward characters and tons of references to video games and comics. It's also a story about accepting your mistakes and learning to grow up. Spoiler alert, it turns out that the reason why Scott Pilgrim is so forgetful about past events is because he doesn't want to accept the bad things he's done. He's been fighting his girlfriend's 7 evil exes, but he's not that much of a hero himself. He's cheated, lied, and beaten people up who didn't deserve it. Scott doesn't become a hero in the comic by brute force. He becomes a hero by accepting his faults and choosing to become a better person. It's amazing how the comic can switch between comedy to sentimentality in an instant. I love how genuine and emotional some parts of it can be, and it's amazing how moving it is for the absolutely silly premise that it has. By the book's end, I just feel this overwhelming sense of satisfaction. It is absolutely hilarious and quirky with references and gags galore, but it's also able to be a sensitive, heartfelt, and meaningful coming-of-age tale that I think almost all of us can relate to. It manages to be such a comforting escape from reality, while also being a reminder to face that reality head on. I have a hard time picking favorites, but I can definitely say that Scott Pilgrim is one of my favorite comics of all time. And I don't think I'm alone in that. Just 6 years after the release of Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, we would see the release of its theatrical adaptation, aptly titled Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. And it is regarded as one of the most unique comic book movies of all time. Directed by Edgar Wright, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World was one of the biggest box office flops of 2010. But I don't think there is anything quite like it. The movie follows the same premise as the comic, with Scott having to defeat Ramona's 7 evil exes to date her. But it is done with an insane amount of love and care. There are so many gags and scenes directly pulled from the comics, from Ramona constantly changing the color of her hair to the delightfully infamous P-bar scene. It's a really faithful adaptation. I don't think I could ask for much more. The movie has a star-studded main cast, with Michael Cera and Mary Elizabeth Winstead taking the lead, but also huge celebrities like Anna Kendrick, Chris Evans, Aubrey Plaza, and Brie Larson being side characters in the film. It's scary and surprising to see just how accurate they adapted most of the characters' looks from the comics. But I think what surprised people most is the film's distinct, stylized look, which is very much inspired by comics and video games. There's onomatopoeia, scenes that resemble comic book panels, and video game UI whenever characters are about to partake in a fight. These elements, in addition to others like the movie's creative transitions and cartoonish settings, gives the film a feel like no other. It is a visual delight to behold, especially when it comes to the fight scenes. They're well choreographed, well edited, and have so much life and power to them. Overall, the movie is simply a visual joy to behold. A masterfully crafted film that looks like nothing we've ever seen before. But as much as people praise this film, and as much as it is a technical marvel, I feel like it didn't resonate with me emotionally. In the comic, there's a kind of sadness to the characters. As light and hilarious as they may be, you can tell that some of them have gone through troubling times, causing them to be who they are today. You see Scott go through guilt and remorse until he finally accepts and takes responsibility for his past actions. It's just amazing character development that isn't really adapted in the film. I don't think it's the film's fault though. The emotional depth of Scott's character in the comics comes from his history with Lisa and Kim, and I don't think the film really had room for this part. I guess I just wish that they made Scott's realization and moral turnaround more powerful, because it feels like the film excuses a lot of his bad behavior. Despite my problem with the movie though, I still acknowledge how special it is. Every scene so carefully put together, every transition so creative and seamless, every action scene gleaming with polish and flair. This movie is one that is oozing with love and care. Edgar Wright did not have to go this hard, but he did, and I really appreciate it. In a sea of stale comic book movies, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World really stands out as one of the most experimental, unique, and faithful comic book adaptations of all time. But there's still one more adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim story that we haven't talked about. The game. Around the same time as the release of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World and Scott Pilgrim's Finest Hour, a video game adaptation of Scott Pilgrim was also released. Developed by Dotemu and published by Ubisoft, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is regarded as one of the best of its kind. Come on, a guy having to fight his girlfriend's 7 evil exes, and he gets coins whenever he beats them? That is a video game premise in and of itself. The name of Scott Pilgrim's band, Sex Bob-omb, is inspired by Bob-ombs from Mario. And whenever weapons would be used in the comic and the movie, it would even show the weapon's stats. Heck, the movie is known more for being a good video game movie than being a good comic book movie. So it was only natural for Scott Pilgrim to get a video game of his own. And it is a pretty good one. Inspired by the arcades of the 80s, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World, the game, is a cooperative fighting game that can be played with up to 3 other players. I started playing on rough and tough difficulty alone, and it was one of the hardest video game experiences ever. See, the progression in this game is weird. Although the game is skill-based, it's more stat-based. Just like in the comics and the movie, you get coins when defeating enemies. and you have to spend those coins in the game to improve your stats. You also get experience points when you defeat baddies, which makes you unlock new moves. But I didn't really get it at the start, so when I played the first level alone, I was an embarrassment to the entire gaming community. I then lowered the difficulty and played as Kim, and it was much more fun. But the real fun started when I finally asked my siblings to play with me. Joining the party was my younger brother, who played as Wallace, my younger sister, who played as Kim, and my youngest sister, who played as Knives. This was when it all finally clicked. It was so fun communicating and cooperating with each other to take down the baddies before us. I have played some other superhero fighting games, but you mostly fight each other in those, which is cool, but there's something about achieving and overcoming odds together that is so fulfilling in a completely different way. It was so fun seeing every new stage we entered, and it was a joy figuring out which enemies do what and how to beat them. Although there are a good amount of things in the game that are accurate with the comics, such as the bosses and the cast of characters you can pick from, what shocked me was the amount of creative liberties the game took. A lot of the baddies you fight are made by the developers from the ground up. For example, a very cool and annoying one for us was the guy in a dinosaur costume, who would quickly stand up and charge at us whenever he was knocked down. The game's fourth level, where you fight Ramona's ex-girlfriend, is set in a completely different place as their battle from the comics. You start at a train, and then you go through multiple Asian settings fighting freaking ninjas, which is absolutely sick. Almost everything in the Scott Pilgrim game is so well done. The electronic soundtrack by Anamanaguchi fits so well. The art direction is simply adorable and charming, and the gameplay is smooth and rarely gets old. But I think my favorite part of the game are the boss battles. Since the bosses don't have health bars, you really have no clue if you're close to beating them or not. You might be transferred to another location in the middle of the battle, or the boss might change their form altogether. These battles are a perfect mix of tense and exciting, with endings you'll never expect. Sometimes they felt anticlimactic and way too easy, and at other times, the rest of us died, and my younger sister, this happened for a bunch of times by the way, had to fend for herself against the boss all alone. Basically, the game was fun. But there were a lot of bugs. The game didn't save our level progress every other session, so we had to constantly replay levels we already beat, which kind of ruined the game a bit for us. It was also difficult to get into stores sometimes, and there was one time everybody died, but I revived with 0 lives and 5 health instead of 3 lives like everyone else. Although these bugs were nothing game-breaking since the game is quite short, it's still pretty annoying to be honest. But even with the bugs, it was still a good game. Scott Pilgrim vs. the World the game is an ode to the past while being an engaging experience for newcomers of the beat-em-up genre. After completing the game, I am already looking forward to playing it again. This time on a difficulty that gamers would actually respect me for beating. After reading the Scott Pilgrim comic, watching the film, and playing the game, I can't help but come away with a sense of amazement and awe. I have experienced the same story retold in 3 different ways, and it never got old. When it comes to the DC animated films directly adapting comic books, I usually prefer one and just kind of ignore the other. For example, the story of Action Comics 775 was adapted into the film Superman vs. the Elite, and I like the movie much more than the comic. On the opposite end, I prefer the Batman Year One comic over the Batman Year One movie. What makes Scott Pilgrim special is that even though I love the comic the most, there is still so much value to watching the movie and playing the video game. Although they have the same basic story, they all specialize in different things. The Scott Pilgrim comic series is much more slice of life, diving deep into its characters and their growth over time. The film, on the other hand, is laser focused on its cinematography and visual style, making it an action-filled spectacle to behold. The game is a fun, playable adaptation of the Scott Pilgrim story that, although buggy, is one of the best beat-em-ups out there. All in all, I am just amazed at how much the creators cared about adapting the Scott Pilgrim story, because each rendition of it isn't just faithful to one another, but also manages to stand on its own. It's no wonder why people love Scott Pilgrim, but I often wonder why it took so long for people to find out about it. What's so weird about Scott Pilgrim to me is how it found success. As most of us know, Scott Pilgrim vs. the World horribly failed at the box office. It's a movie that found its audience years after release. But I don't think many people know that the first volume of Scott Pilgrim also sold poorly. When Volume 1, Scott Pilgrim's Precious Little Life, was released in August 2004, it didn't sell very well. In fact, it had a lower initial order than Lost at Sea, which, if you don't know, is Brian Lee O'Malley's previous graphic novel. Even the video game faced a roadblock when it was removed from stores in 2014 and only came back for the film's 10th anniversary. I genuinely love all three renditions of the Scott Pilgrim story, but I also wish it was more successful right from the beginning. It's a shame it took so long for it to find success, but at least it did, which is something I can't say for a lot of other creative projects. In the age of the internet, where everyone is hyper-competitive and is trying to get your attention, good art can often be left by the wayside. And I think we all know some examples. We all have that favorite musician, YouTuber, animated show, comic, or video game that is just not as famous as we'd like them to be. But at the same time, our individual voices have never been more powerful. We've memed Morbius enough for it to be re-released in theaters, annoyingly requested the Snyder Cut until it became a reality, and turned ugly Sonic into a beauty. We have sent amazing indie games by small teams to the top of the charts, and way more. I cannot overstate how a lot of the things I love right now came from weird coincidences and people telling me how much they love some pieces of media. Word of mouth is how Scott Pilgrim found success, and as small as you may feel, know that your voice matters. So this isn't just a video on Scott Pilgrim. This is a request to use your voice to pave the way for the next one to come.